building ingin mugdam galinga nani ya na mogop ner ko delia magayam ko delinga ko de building Papua New Guinea en ko de ya mugbun gam ko de mung en gana mangani na mogop ner delinga pugu yam anda ko ba mu yok ngurun mugun ko de pe bo de bom pe mogum pe gun do jam bon e bom pe no junga ni mugdam galinga no manu wang de pe yam pe ta Ugumang marne mugite galinga engin dama angani. I speak as a Moge person located here in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. As a Moge person, I acknowledge my ancestry, those forefathers and mothers that steadfastly claimed this land and protected it for those of us who are following. And I acknowledge that. I also acknowledge other indigenous community members that are in this forum today, that we acknowledge their ancestry, their history and their heritage, and their legacies, of course, are now very much a part of them as they sit in this forum. I welcome you all on behalf of all of us to this very significant and important meeting for us. In this day and age with many, many things happening, peace indeed we need to find. And if there are, we need to share so that in the sharing we may find more so that we can really acknowledge our ancestry and leave a legacy for those that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Dr. Michael Mel speaking to us, acknowledging and welcoming us from his home up in Mount Hagen in PNG. Hello, everybody. My name's James Cox. I am the Executive Director of Peacifica, which is a small organisation focused on peace building, peace and justice issues in the South Pacific primarily. And my brief is somewhat wider on this occasion today. Thank you all, and so many of you, looking at the numbers of people coming in, thank you all for taking time here on a Friday afternoon, and especially at the end of what has been a hectic week in the Raising Peace Festival. I know that I can recognise many of the names on the participant list here. You're almost like old friends now, as we've had we've probably broken 1,000 separate people who have registered for events over the course of the week. It's been a remarkable time that we've all spent together, and I hope that you've been able to take part in and enjoy some of the events that have gone along the way. So it's a Friday afternoon, and we have a great situation of a really packed panel today, and so we're going to be talking about things in a fairly quick moving way, hopefully. And I'm delighted that we have this cross-section of the thousands of people, organisations who dedicate themselves to preventing violence, negotiating peace, and confronting the physical and human legacies of past conflict from the Pacific and from Asia here today. It was a daunting prospect to encompass all of that when I was asked to bring this session together, and I'm delighted that everyone I asked to be a part of it said yes, and also that others approached Raising Peace to be a part of it too. So it's a quick survey today, and it's not only peace building. I think it covers a whole variety of other sort of peace actions. So we're going to be talking today about peacemaking, decolonisation, reconciliation, negotiation and mediation, activism, seeking and making justice, and a long, slow work of cleaning up. Our panel is made up of people who either base their work from Australia or have done key parts of their past work here. There are so many ways that Australia can be a force for peace in the world. And even as we fall short, I hope that some of these stories, and indeed those that we've been hearing throughout the Raising Peace Festival, will inspire you all to take action and support others as they do the same. We heard on Tuesday from Costa Rica's Ambassador Vargas about how creating and sustaining a peaceful society is an ongoing process that requires constant work. So let's explore what some of that work can look like. So before I go in, quick bit of housekeeping. The chat there is there for you to use, and we'll be collecting any questions that you may have, and we'll try and answer those sort of either along the way or towards the end. But first of all, I'm going to do a quick lightning introduction of people. We're going to introduce them in more depth, but just to give you a sense of the geography that we're covering here. You met Dr. Michael Mel up in Papua New Guinea, and just to the west of him, but actually speaking from Canberra, we have Ronny Kareni. Focusing on the Pacific region, we have Tilly Byrne and Jeanne Wells of SafeGround. Speaking for the Australian South Sea Islanders, from her home in Pyrmont is the mighty Emelda Davis. And from the Philippines, hopefully we will have Christine Almoite. She wasn't able to join us before, but I hope she's come on soon. Talking about Myanmar, based in Cambodia, we have Emma Leslie, and finally representing, speaking on issues related to Afghanistan, we have Susanne Schmeidl, who's also here in Sydney. So you can see we're covering some ground all across the region. But what I want to do now is to begin, and I think I might go to Ronny Kareni first up. Let's talk about West Papua, one of Australia's closest neighbours. Hello, Ronny, and welcome. Putting you on the spot as our first speaker. And I guess my first questions to you are: who are you, and what do you do?
Thank you, James. Firstly, I also would like to echo the acknowledgement and respect to the elders, past, present, from the land and the people of Ngunnawal and Ngambri here in Canberra. And like many First Nation Indigenous people around the world, we continue to fight for our dignity and as well as our land, protecting the sovereign land. And I myself grew up in Papua New Guinea for several years as a refugee. My parents, mostly my mom, took me across and fled across to PNG, and now living here, supported by the Australia West Papua Association. It's a network of supporters for West Papua right to self-determination struggle. And I'm lucky to be here and to be the voice of my people and continue to amplify the voice that has often been ignored or not heard a lot when it comes to human rights situation, arbitrary detention of peaceful activists, and land grabbing, and the militarization, as well as the role of foreign investors and governments and donors through multinational companies or transnational companies that are exploiting and plundering the land. So at the moment, I am the basically West Papuan consultant, like to the Pacific Mission for the United Liberation Movement for West Papua, political and diplomatic arm in addressing the self-determination issue. A musician as well in using music and cultural movement through Rise of the Morning Star, and framing the Melanesian identity of who we are, given with the framing and narrative from Indonesia that West Papua is part of Indonesia on the legal and political, but we framing that we are one people, we share the kinship with the Melanesia, even throughout Torres Strait and to the Pacific through sea voyaging and navigation. So that's one thing I do that, and been living here in Canberra and continue to advocate for the issue of West Papua on human rights and political rights.
That's you've got a lot going on. What are the things in all of that? The struggle to help and protect and support people who are working for peace in a very strong conflict situation is an ongoing challenge, and like sort of striving for peace in a conflict like that must be a very difficult thing to pursue.
It is a very difficult and challenging thing to advocate for our people back home in West Papua. But one thing that the people of West Papua, through our faith and customary leaders, have declared that West Papua is the land of peace. And it is profound in terms of how the movement have really come this far, where the use of civil resistance, non-violence approach to pursue the aspirations of our people. And it continues to be echoed throughout the generations, and my generation now, that we continue to come out and building solidarity and raising peace in that framework. But at the same time, of course, in terms of as indigenous people of our land, our sovereign right to the land, connection to the land, and the external concept of self-determination, where we have not exercised the political rights with the various different powers that came and occupy, especially from the Dutch prior to that, from the Dutch and then into Indonesia in the 60s, which now has put West Papua under immense, horrendous experiences under brutal occupation. We continue to find hope and peace through our cultural practices, and that often comes through music, poetry, and to be able to support each other. And that has seen that continues to give us hope and courage in the face of tyranny that the people of West Papua continues to face. And the impacts of colonization, especially impacts of capitalist interest and geopolitical, geostrategic interest, has placed West Papua under this immense challenge. And as we speak here around raising peace, peace begins as well with recognition of indigenous sovereignty, the self-determination of the people. And especially here, I understand and know in terms of the First Nation people in this country, justice and recognition of the sovereignty of this land has not been ceded. It is important that, our issues in building peace begins with recognizing sovereignty of the First Nation people here, as well as the self-determination of the people, even including with West Papua and in the region where decolonization is an unfinished business. And it continues within the Pacific. There are other self-determination struggles. The people of Kanaki in December will come into the third referendum. The people of Bougainville has voted and in the process of determining their self-government, as well as the people of Maui Nui continue, which even they listed it within the UN Decolonization Committee, yet the bigger powers within the region continue to suppress and delay those processes. And for us, that is where peace, raising peace and awareness building begins with this recognition of sovereignty and self-determination of the people within those regions.
Yeah, that connection of the struggle between West Papua and Bougainville and Kanaki and so on is something that we don't often see those as a sort of a connected thread. You see all of those things as separate things. As people are sort of striving to get their own piece of autonomy. But I think the solidarity of the people who are sort of working for autonomy or independence across all of those is something that we could learn some more about. Yes, just briefly, you talked about you're a musician, and its role that it plays in grounding people in sort of culture and maintain that focus. Do you have any examples of where you've seen that in play?
Since the movement, the Black Lives Matter movement came about with the death of in the US, George Floyd. Here in Australia, in terms of as musicians and artists, there was a big conversation. The movement was also kind of taken up here, and it was one of those rare opportunities where another brother from PNG, Irileke Ingram, and having a conversation with a lot of the First Nation musicians such as Yotu Yindi, Bart Willoughby, Emma Donovan, Delene Briscoe, and then the concept of Blacktivism came up, and this was the conversations that we engaged with the Melbourne Arts Centre, as well as talking to the government around addressing this, but within the arts and music, driven by the artists. So early this year in April, we were given the green light to go ahead and organize the Blacktivism concert at the Maya Music Bowl. And it's all about protest songs, going back to the issues that are talked or spread through music and the power of music. And as many know, with my band, it's Sorong Samurai. So we're framing from the western end of New Guinea. There's a town called Sorong, and on the eastern side in Papua New Guinea, Samurai. So it's reframing the thinking that from Sorong to Samurai, we are one people, we share the one land, one skin, one salt water, and using that to come and then we perform. So at various music venues, and this year in April, that was one of the opportunity that we used to address Black Lives Matter here in this country, as well as connecting that through the indigenous artists coming together in one platform and sharing that. And we continue and aim that we can build that more together with the First Nation musicians and artists to continue to echo the rights and sovereignty and self-determination of our people.
Wow. That sounds like it was an incredible event. And I'm going to use that as an excuse to travel halfway from Sorong to Samurai to Mount Hagen. Michael Mel, a philosopher, artist, curator, and trying to be a gardener these days as well. How are you, Michael? And tell us about what you've been up to.
Yeah, thank you, James. And thank you to everyone for being here today and for giving me an opportunity to share. Thank you to Ronny, absolutely powerful work that you continue to do. And certainly it's a long way, but definitely not alone in spirit and also in many other ways. Coming back to the point, I'm basically now at home. Gardening, you're right, James. I think I do mind missing out on the beer and the barbecue now and again, but that's okay. I think going back to sweet potato and stuff that's coming in from the ground certainly makes a lot of difference, and it brings me back to my childhood. But more importantly, it brings me right back to where I would like to be. And Ronny mentioned about land and land ownership and belonging somewhere. It definitely feels that way, that you, while the tensions and things like that, of which I'll speak of in a moment or two, having to have a land and having to cultivate it and having to know that you have a place to stay. Very different to living in Australia in a rented accommodation, that you have a square foot plot that you call yours, and but at the end of the day, it belongs to the state. In PNG, things are a little bit different, where you have your own land and you can have a portion of that to really say it's yours. And then you can also pass it on to the next generation, if you like. So in that sense, there's certainly a sense of peace and a sense of, if you like, serenity, knowing these kinds of things that are there. Obviously, money and a lot of other things provide a number of tensions, but primarily my objective of wanting to come home is really that. As well as that, secondly, of course, my last posting was in the Australian Museum, and I enjoyed that stint. Was great, but in as much as I really enjoyed the collection, I really felt that I was telling the collector's story, not my story. And so I needed to come back to really provide a voice. And should the Australian Museum or any other museum be interested in our voices, then they should collect it from us. That's a way of making peace, I suppose, in reclaiming some places, to saying that those places should be shared spaces, not telling your story in the manner that you should be, and then collecting a native from up in the highlands of New Guinea, putting him into metropolitan Sydney and say, speak your language and do these things, which I did, and I enjoyed it, but I think the politics of it got the better of me, so I'm enjoying myself in doing what I'm doing here. So absolutely enjoying myself. In terms of peace and peacemaking, in terms of the highlands, the kind of societies that I can speak of today are no longer the societies that I can connect with of my own childhood or indeed of my parents, who are still with me, and I am the main carer at the moment for them, which is another way of making peace with your families, making peace with your ancestry. We believe very strongly in kindred spirits in terms of our families and our legacies. So caring for those that are frail and fragile is a very significant aspect of making peace with yourself and with your community and family, and for those that are beyond us who have left us. And that sense of spirituality is very significant, which I find in living in Australia was not for me. And so coming home to my community and my family and my parents, it's really about finding peace myself. So that, in a way, is a significant aspect for me in really talking about peace and peacemaking. Papua New Guineans, historically, 100 years ago, they reconciled quite often. In other words, they made peace in many ways. I can't speak for everybody in terms of the highlands or indeed PNG in general. But certainly, it was a very different society. Colonization, of course, provided for a different tangent. And the stories that we now know and that continue to frame Papua New Guinea, for better or worse, and more often worse than better, quite often makes it for a turmoil-filled place and of thugs and rascals and humbuggery and whatever you. But in general, I think there are so many issues post-colonial societies have to offer. And I think in that sense, reconciliation, peacemaking, and peaceful societies were some of the things that really made PNG great and continues to make it great. And I find that. And in post-colonial societies today, we contend with so many issues, but very briefly, neocolonialism is certainly there. Those who have been educated in Western language and Western ways and so forth have to now compete with our own languages and our own ways, and which ones take priority, and what languages do we use, and what ways then, what values do we advocate for, and balancing those things between Western and local provides for a very interesting tussle for many people in Papua New Guinea. So when you're talking about peace and reconciliation, you're talking about things with Western law, as opposed to methods and means that were used in the traditional law in the bygone era, where reconciliation was very significant, where communities mattered most, whereas Western law is very much centered on one person. So if you want to find peace, you want to find peace by law, but at the same time, living in PNG, you belong to communities. So those kinds of locations and dislocations provide for many, many challenges for Papua New Guinea in terms of creating a peaceful society. And particularly in the highlands where I am now. Of course, in a post-colonial society, we now deal with exploitation, we deal with plundering, we're dealing with climate change, so many issues. Papua New Guinea provides so much in terms of wealth, both natural as well as other. And of course, the natural wealth has been taken off in terms of mining and gas and oil and forest, fisheries, what have you. And a lot of that has been taken out, and it's all for economic growth and what have you. But of course, one of the major outcomes of this is climate change, of course. And climate change is very much affecting the highlands as well as the islands, the coastals as well as those of us in the hills. So in that sense, those issues are real. So within those kinds of turmoils, where do we and how do we navigate peace? And how do we navigate and challenge ourselves to find normality when everything's not normal? COVID also is now beginning to throw a spanner in the works. So
yeah, Michael, that the tension, the connection between your personal, like that inner quest for peace, and in terms of how you're living your own life, and you or any other person in the country, and these larger issues is a particularly interesting aspect of it. How the internal and the external relate to each other.
Very much so, and for me now, it's really developing societies, and I can't necessarily go across the country and say about this, but certainly within my community, balancing between communities that you want to make peace. If there is any issues to be settled, how do you then go? There is the law represented by the police, represented by the law of the land, and so going that way. On the other hand, you come back to community, you come back to leadership, but that leadership is not the same anymore. The councillors of old are not the same councillors. The leaders of today are no longer the same. So it provides a lot of tensions for peaceful communities and peaceful societies where you know that you've got land, you can do your own things, but you've got people now disenfranchised largely through Western education who have a challenge of going home and going home to a village location where it's no longer the same. The diet is not the same. Food gardens have changed completely in relation to rice, noodles, a lot of imported material that has become part of it. So if we really think about communities like PNG, where you do have a sense of your place because you're politically independent, but you have got so many challenges within as well as from without. And from without, the economic interests and people from the outside having a perception about PNG and constructing PNG in the way they do. But also within PNG, we have individuals and communities that have now begun to become educated in Western ways. And yet some of the values that have been for eons have been part of us. How do you make them resurface? How do you reconnect those aspects to today? I think those provide for very interesting, challenging times for me. And in my own work that I'm doing at the moment is really bringing the past to the present and then reconnecting that to children. For example, the introduction of local languages and vernacular. And that is a clear indication of a sense of place, a sense of difference. English is one language, but your vernacular is another language. Of course, within language, there is so much in knowing a language. And so having to forget your own language and having to acquire English, and provided that the English that you learn is a mixed bag of aspects that I think that are very challenging for us. But having to have your own language as well as English and any other language, I think provides for a significant part of our communities, as well as that, food. So I'm now making efforts now to advocate for local food, and our local food needs to be more and more. Many of our lifestyle diseases that are now prominent in PNG are largely based on diet. And a large percentage or portion of our diet is very much on imported food. Yet the kinds of environments that we belong to provision for a variety and range that are much healthier. But the choices and options are quite often dominated by the imported rather than the local. So having to now advocate and actually go out and showing all of that, I'm not the only one. There is quite a number of us who are now advocating for this, and across the Pacific, I believe. And so in that sense, these are some real efforts now to bringing the past to the present, that we can travel together with anything that's coming from the outside and we can better manage.
Okay, Michael.
Yeah.
We might move on to our next question here,
please.
and we'll have a chance to look at then how we bring the present and past into the future, I guess, when we come back shortly.
Thanks.
But yeah, anyone who was at the permaculture session this morning, I think will have lots of things pinging in their head and connections in terms of this, and this sort of real strong, grounded, earth-based approach to engendering peace in a community. I don't think Christine is here. Christine, if you are here, unmute and make a noise so we can say hello and bring you in. But otherwise, I will head down south to talk about the Australian South Sea Islanders and Emelda. So some of you will have met Emelda already on Saturday morning in the phenomenal first of our First Nations event on the day, and throughout that day the idea of waking the snake was brought out. But Emelda, how's the waking the snake going, and what else is occupying your mind?
Well, first and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Gadigal country, one of the 29 clans of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge all those on this call today and the Indigenous lands, wherever you are in the world, that are unceded and always was, always will be First Nations people's lands. Thanks for having me, James. And I know we've talked a lot about peace building and what is peace building, and some of the challenges that we're facing with as marginalised communities. But the waking the snake, yeah, that's a First Nations storyline in relation to obviously ancient knowledge base, customary practices, history, learning from the past, all of this stuff that needs to be led, and first and foremost by First Nations peoples of their regions. The work that we're doing is place-based work, and that work is essential in making change through self-determination. And this is not taking away from the brilliant people, that are all contributing and working to build peace. But it's important that in this space where atrocities are occurring, the solutions come from the people. It's a lived experience, a lot of these things. And I'd like to acknowledge Michael and your wonderful welcome to country. Thank you. And it's good to see you again, and Ronny and everybody else on the panel today. But for those who, and I know, people have heard of indentured labour, Australian South Sea Islanders, and, when is she going to stop talking about it? But she's not. So Australian South Sea Islanders are, we're descendants of a significant slave trade in this country that reaped the Pacific of some 60-odd thousand. And prior to that, in the 1840s, there were 1.5 million Asian and Indigenous peoples trafficked throughout the Pacific, building nations through colonisation. But for Australia in particular, my grandfather at the age of 12, that's my mother's father. This is how young this history still sits with us in our families. The ongoing generational trauma that we're facing. And you're still seeing that with, other countries that are on this call today through colonisation and dispossession, and the lack of understanding and respect for First Nations peoples and their self-determination. But Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, PNG, Fiji, New Caledonia are just some of those specific islands that were reaped of entire male populations, in many cases for small island states. Some 800 shipping routes, as you can see on the map that I've got up here where my afro is disappearing into the blue screen. 800 shipping routes brought our people to this country to build the economy. This started illegally with 1847 with Benjamin Boyd, celebrated entrepreneur and parliamentarian, with the influx to Queensland through blackbirders such as Robert Townsville, John Mackay between 1863 and 1901. The 1860s also saw New South Wales Port Jackson here, Sydney Harbour, deploy South Sea Islanders to the Torres Strait. And then also simultaneously, the London missionaries coming through, some 3,000 in settling through Christianity and what you call today coming of the light, which is a celebration of that Christianity coming to our Torres Strait Islands. With the 95% being men and some women and children, some 5%, there were 15,000 that died from common disease as a part of this trade within the first 6 months. White Australia policy deported us en masse back to some islands, and, you know, of course, Aboriginal Protection Acts of Federation absorbed us under the 1930s as, you know, in us relinquishing or having to give up our identity as another form of genocide. Through this Melanesian region of, you know, I guess, dispossession for our people, organisations were born as a part of the advocacy and the peace building required in reconciling with the truth of slavery in this country and genocide. In 1903, the first Pacific Island organisation was established in Mackay to advocate for the inclusion and for some, I think it was 3,000 South Sea Islanders to actually stay here because they had established families. So I guess our organisation, I'm the chair of Australian South Sea Islanders, Port Jackson, and it's very much about self-determination, self-governance, but working with goodwill, working with the kindness and generosity of so many across this nation that want to see social justice for a peoples that have gone as a forgotten part of this narrative. And when I talk about place-based and specifically community-led, those leaders need to come together. People on this call need to come together, and we need to sit down and maybe have a forum with Zoom and other opportunities to speak about what does this cultural framework look like that we're tackling here. We're all doing formidable work in all parts of the world, but at the same time, what does that look like for us in terms of leadership and holding the governments accountable, creating change policy through policy and legislation? You know, there's all certain layers of advocacy and representation that can take place with all of these great initiatives that we're hearing today. So, you know, I'm not speaking at you, I'm speaking to people about how do we work better together. I think I'll leave it there because I've got a few other things that we could talk about as we progress throughout the day, but thank you, Chimas.
No, thank you, Emelda. I just one question to follow up. So a couple of months ago, there was some form of apology or reconciliation. Was it in Mackay, in Queensland?
It was in Bundaberg, Queensland, which is that was fantastic.
Yeah,
that was great. That was something that was brought around through our Vanuatu High Commissioner, who's based here in Canberra, Samson Vilvil-Farrer, in speaking to Bundaberg, because as you know, we've got a modern day blackbirding happening with seasonal work in this country, and they're reaping those same islands and bringing in a lot more women as well as a part of this particular trade that puts food on our tables and, fills our supermarkets. So with that, with the work and the advocacy that we've been doing on the ground with other Australian South Sea Islander communities, in Bundaberg in particular, the Mayor spoke with our High Commissioner and also Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and they resolved the matter that, we should come up with some sort of sister city agreement with Santo in particular, Santo Council. So because when you look at Bundaberg and Santo, they're on the same, latitude? Yeah, in terms of that they look at each other. So in terms of that particular shipping route, my grandfather was one of those first children to come in through Bundaberg port. So, and because of the Mayor's good relationship with community and the work that we did in 2012 through the One Talk capacity building conferences, we hosted 5 conferences on, I think it was $50,000 with the support of Tony Abbott, Prime Minister and Cabinet, and we negotiated and discussed a national voice to Parliament. And we had the support of Gilbert and Tobin law firm, and the Mayor of Bundaberg was a part of that first conference. So, and his lived experience with the Australian South Sea Islander community. There was also an apology to the First Nations people because of the, the frontier wars, I guess I could say, where South Sea Islanders and Aboriginal communities were warring on country, and that story sits within the community. So we did a whole ceremony around that, and I guess it's just building on more of, this is peace building, isn't it? So that gesture of apology is greatly accepted, and we are very appreciative, but we need some more action around some of that lip service that happens for us, because we're 170 years later and we're telling the same stories.
Yeah. Thank you, Emelda. Just before you move off, I might actually, if you can move to your left so people can look at that map. Sorry, other way, that way, yes.
Yeah.
Just you talked about Bundaberg and Santo, looking across at each other, and this is one of the things that I think we don't appreciate enough in this country, is the way that wonderful arc of the South Pacific Islands going, PNG through Bougainville and on down to Fiji at the bottom end, looks across the Coral Sea to here in Australia, and we look back out at them. And that's not something that I think we have focused on enough and sat with to understand our place in the world. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. That's why I put that up there, and it just shows the interconnected with, Australia's home to one of the largest Melanesian populations, outside of their Pacific nations, and some 500 guesstimate Pacific Island peoples. It's a significant, force. And then you've got the descendants of this particular trade interconnected with the Aboriginal and the Torres Strait Islander kinship. So what does that look like? We're not talking to each other enough. Through forums like this, of course, it's important. But the thing is, we've got to bring this change. It sits with us. It's our responsibility. We talk about ancestral and spirituality and reconnection with culture and identity. Until we have peace within our own communities and our own displaced peoples, it's going to be a big challenge. A really big challenge.
Thanks, Emelda. We're going to change our focus completely now, and I'm going to bring in Susanne Schmeidl. Hello, Susanne. Just tell us about something yourself. Suzanne's going to be focusing on Afghanistan today, so it's the far end of our whole arc of interest today.
Hi, I want to start as well by acknowledging that I'm sitting on stolen land. And as Emelda, I'm sitting in the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I want to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. And perhaps while we're changing our context and perhaps also who you're looking at, me as a white face, a person working on peace issues, not necessarily in my own country, I think that a lot of the things that both Michael and Emelda have said actually don't change the context, just re-emphasize how we haven't been listening in more Western designed, supported peace initiatives. But first about myself, I'm originally from Germany, so my ancestors committed war and committed genocide. I was raised very strongly in the understanding that when you come from such a legacy of violence and crimes against humanity, you have a responsibility to ensure that you work in your own life and in your work to make the world a better place and a more peaceful place. And that's what really brought me into the peace movement quite early on the grassroots in Germany. I later participated in peace brigades in Nicaragua. And then through various, after my PhD, I started working with an organization called Swiss Peace, the Swiss Peace Foundation. And we collaborated with partners in the Horn of Africa to develop conflict early warning mechanisms. And then through another journey. I started getting involved with Afghanistan, which will I talk to you about. And I've worked quite extensively in Afghanistan since about 2000. And I would always say my work was really to work with grassroots organizations, and I helped co-found 2 organizations on what we call in German civilian peace building, and to differentiate it from peace building where you try to use force. And one of them actually, and that's where I think what Michael has been saying, one of the organizations is now called the Liaison Office, but started out as called the Tribal Liaison Office. And that was established when elders came quite early on in 2003. So shortly when the Western Project in Afghanistan started, came to us and said, look, we hear you are interested in building peace, but everybody talks about this modern civil society, which we don't really understand what that is. But, you know, we as, you know, the custodians, the community elders, we have basically helped our communities to bring peace for a very, very long time. And they had been actually excluded in Western design projects, because I think many of the Western countries that got involved, they don't understand their own history. I think that is a big problem. Secondly, they've lost community. I think many of the Western, they don't understand what communities anymore, and the role the community leaders, but also faith leaders particularly, play in holding, you know, providing, you know, consistent community and really helping there to survive. And because we like to work with people that look like us. I think there's a lot of in there, because the traditional elders Afghanistan, you know, as one USAID woman once said to me, how do I know you don't work with the Taliban insurgency? Because they have beards, they have turbans, different from us. So they come to us, and that's when we set up that organization. And that's where the liaison came from, is to create that liaison between the, you know, the village and the center, and to help in engagement with these elders. But I would actually say this was never really done well. I do think that many more projects were in urban areas. There was a strong undermining of elders as well. And a lot of that comes because of the failure of understanding context. I think I've heard that as well from my previous colleagues, that often we go into a new context and actually try to understand it, don't try to learn about it. We don't have the humility to listen and the humility perhaps to try to do things differently than we might do at home, and to try to integrate these structures that have essentially helped Afghan society survive for a long, long time. I think that the legacy, what we're seeing now, I think so spectacularly fell apart, as many of you maybe have heard, in mid-August, is because I think there was a lot of what I call, you know, window dressing, smoke screen, a lot in the cities. And in the end, when things spectacularly fell apart, who stepped in and negotiated peaceful surrender with the Taliban insurgency to avoid more bloodshed and war? It was these very customary elders. They ended up stepping up to the plate, even though they had been excluded and sidelined in the Western State Building and Peace Building project. And it comes with a lot of pain for me personally, my colleagues, to have watched the past 2 decades. And in many ways, I wonder how good or bad a peace support person I was, because my role often was that liaison, trying to help my Afghan partners to get funding, trying to translate what they want to do in that donor speak, the very technocratic, you know, terminology du jour that donors like to use about what should happen, and also try to get donors to understand. I think they don't fully understood that peace is a process. It's not a project. It is like a project, or one project after the other that duplicated, never a process. Funding was often very short term. Yeah. And then peace can't be built while you're still fighting a war. Contradiction Afghanistan that brought us to today. But I'm already getting too much. Probably in the next question. I apologize.
That's fine. Just a quick follow-up, building on that. I mean, I have to sort of just first of all recognise the personal, the sadness that sits with you and many other people who have been working on Afghanistan for a long time. And that's something that I think probably has applied in a lot of places around the world, is particularly apparent right now for you and your colleagues. But this distinction between civilian peace building and institutional peace building, or whatever it is, I think is a challenging one for us overall, where situations like this, where you can be working so hard and so passionately and so effectively at these local levels, can be undermined by the larger mistakes that seem to be often be made by those with the bigger levers to pull.
Yeah, no, but also what I think is that often when you want to support, you want an organization to give that support, right? Somebody can write a project, a log frame, etc. You very rarely understand how you support communities and how you support, more the leaders within the communities. I think we're just very, very bad at that. And maybe that's also because we don't do it well at home yet, and how we strengthen our own community leaders. And also, as I said, because we don't listen enough. A lot of the settler colonial states that were involved in Afghanistan, I think probably hadn't listened to their First Nations people. And I want to give a concrete example. There's something called like tribal policing in Afghanistan, where, communities raise a non-violent police force for law and order in the absence, call it community policing. It's called the Arbaki. And there was some interest by donors. And once the Canadians say, I said, well, have you engaged with it? And then they said, yeah, we brought somebody over to talk to them. I said, who did you bring over? It was the White Mountie. I said, why did you not bring the First Nation community leader? I think they would have much better understood what communities were trying to do. They would have been much better to advise you perhaps on how to design and engage these programs. And that struck me. And the same thing when we were working, and that's what Michael was saying, struggled. A lot of Afghanistan, again, is very much built on customary mechanisms, and particularly for conflict resolution. We haven't really actually worked with them. It's a restorative justice system. It's not a punitive justice system. It's basically bringing peace between communities. Often the West looked at it as being a lesser system, a system that, because it doesn't acknowledge individual justice, but rather than looking with customary elders and how this could be used to heal the wounds of the past, or how it could be perhaps reformed to avoid some of what, the West sees, that one was that you give a woman in exchange for crimes committed, because we don't understand that so the communities don't fight with each other, right? So you give something. And it depends, on the other ways you can do it, but often, it was just judged very harshly. And I think that came from a lacking understanding. And I think for me, one of the biggest lessons is that we need to be humble, we need to listen, we need to understand context more, because in the end, peace takes time.
Yeah.
Look, we had 20 years and we're almost back to 20 years before.
Yeah.
So in many ways, people feel there was time wasted and efforts wasted.
Anyone who was at the Afghan panel earlier this week and encountered those amazing people who had benefited from those 20 years must derive some hope, but still that the mountain is high, I think, Susanne.
There's a way to the top, but we just were, as an Afghan friend said to me, there's always a way to the top of the mountain, but we were nearly there and then we were toppled down and now we have to climb back up.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say, one of the messages that I find difficult, why does it always take people like me to translate knowledge? Why does it always need these translator and mediators? Why can't we just learn to work with the people in the context that we...
Yeah.
And I think that's what the Afghanistan panel was saying too, right? You just don't take us seriously. And I just don't know why. And that's I think, one of the biggest mistakes we make in peace building as well. We always look to these translators. Ideally, you shouldn't need me. In the end, you shouldn't.
Yes, we're making steps, but we're not there yet. But now I'm going to move on, Susanne. Thank you. And all the way back to the Pacific, to our friends from SafeGround, and it's Jeanne, isn't it? You're first up, yes.
Yeah.
So Jeanne Wills, and I actually introduced the wrong member of your team in our bit at the start there. But yes, hello, welcome. Tell us about SafeGround and your work.
Thank you, James. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which I'm presenting to you all today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I also pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So it's a real pleasure to be on this panel today. I'm fairly new to the peace building community, so it's an absolute privilege to be here. So I'm a research assistant at SafeGround, and yeah, I'm joined today by my colleague Elise. So she'll be talking later to you all. So SafeGround works to protect people from legacy and indiscriminate weapons, and has engaged with people affected by war and conflict. So we're currently working towards a Pacific free of weapons contamination with our Pacific Outreach project, which began in July. So I guess to give you all a brief overview of the issue, today, like some 88 years after the Second World War, weapons contamination still threatens the lives, the livelihoods, the safety and development in the Pacific and Pacific Island nations. So these countries have never started international wars, but yeah, we're invaded by forces waging war in the region. And 9 Pacific countries are still littered with unexploded ordnance, abandoned stockpiles that are left in the field or left in accessible waters. So the affected nations are Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. So I guess stability and prosperity, we think, does rely partly on the clearance of these explosive remnants. The Pacific aren't in the global spotlight in terms of international mine action, and there's been limited clearance efforts to date, with the exception of Palau and Honiara in the Solomon Islands. So I guess because of the limited attention, there's also a lack of knowledge and information of the extent of the contamination, because there hasn't been any comprehensive survey of the area. So I guess our work is focused in the Pacific Islands, and since 2008, SafeGround has promoted mine action in the Pacific, and in 2015, SafeGround sent researchers John Rodstead and Mette Elise-Houston, who's our project manager, to the Solomon Islands, and they photographed and reported the effects of unexploded ordnance on locals. So yeah, you can find out more about this on our website if you would like to know more. And I guess the initial stages of the project that we're working on now have involved like an analysis of mine action spending in the Pacific Islands, as well as we're building a big stakeholder database to promote, collaboration and peace building. And yeah, so I guess Elise will talk a bit later about what we're doing next, and I guess what we hope for in the future. So thank you so much for having me.
No worries. Thank you. It's something that just doesn't get nearly enough attention, except for when something goes wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
There was an example recently. Yeah. Like it's just so underreported, especially in the media. But I guess the most recent one that I guess reached here was only in May this year. So yeah, it's pretty pressing. Yeah. Well, the clearing ordnance is certainly something that's also a major issue in Southeast Asia also. So I'll bring in Emma Leslie at this point, based in Cambodia, but for the purposes of today, talking more about Myanmar. But Emma, you may have something to bounce off Jeanne's thing there as well from where you sit.
Amazing to be in this circle of, I'm going to use Emelda's word, formidable peace people, because I think there's all of us want to talk about the terrible things we're seeing in the world, but when you see this kind of gathering, you get so much energy and possibility and understanding that we are shifting and that people are using language differently. We are attempting to listen more. We are trying to be connected. So big warm greetings, very warm, very humid, about to crack down huge rain from Cambodia. We are in the midst of another round of lockdown here, although we're 80% vaccinated. So great to be connecting from one lockdown to another. I think, I had the privilege of growing up on Wiradjuri country in Bathurst in New South Wales, where at the time that I was going through school, we learned a lot about genocide, different types of genocide. And I had a brilliant history teacher, Jeanne, who taught us about the genocide in Australia, but she also taught us about genocide in Cambodia. And through that, I developed a close connection with Cambodia some 25 years ago, coming here to work and falling in love with the Cambodian and now staying. And so here I am, a Cambodian Australian citizen today. I am the executive director of the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, which is a Cambodian NGO by design. Our intention is to share with the world what Cambodians have learned about peace processes and passing through extreme periods of violence and extraordinary resilience. And one of the things that people say in Cambodia is when you've experienced such violence, the only thing that remains is compassion. And I think that's what I feel in this circle of people, is a circle of people who've obviously, there are genocide survivors amongst us, but equally those who then turn that into some kind of force for good. And that's why we're working on Myanmar, because the situation in Myanmar for some 25, 70, hundreds of years has been one of structural violence, deep structural violence. I think as I listen to the stories shared here today, that's something we're all grappling with, is the kind of systemic and structural violence that's inside our constitutions, inside the way we talk about history. It's a way that policies get developed that continue to exclude people. And so Myanmar, of course, is no different to that. But what we're seeing in Myanmar, and I guess there'll be time to talk a bit more about it, but let me just touch on a little bit now. Our role has been to accompany those national stakeholders who are really driving a process behind the scenes against what has been a very ridiculous, bloody, failed coup d'etat from February 1. And of course, the international media likes to focus, just as in Afghanistan the last few weeks, on the sort of, oh my goodness, how horrible this terrible thing is happening. And yet for 70 years, for 20 years, for however long, we haven't talked about what was going on under the surface. So the young generation in Myanmar has been waging a civil disobedience movement, which says enough is enough. And when I hear their voices, I hear them saying to us, enough is enough military system, but enough is enough the kind of patronizing, patriarchal pacification peace processes that we've been giving people for these last 20, 30, 40 years. And I think we just heard a little bit about that in terms of Afghanistan, as Susan spoke. It's the kind of international system which won't stand behind hard values, which won't speak up for human rights, which won't actually alter narratives inside the way that we teach history, the way that we speak about things. Michael spoke about it in terms of being expected to come to Sydney to speak his language instead of people coming to him. So I think we see it in so many different ways. And this generation is saying, don't send us a mediator. Don't ask us to compromise. Don't take us to a dialogue table where we're expected to give up something. We already gave up everything. This is not a negotiation anymore. We're taking back our country. We're taking back our system. And while we're doing it, we're going to grow something incredible, something different, something values-driven, something that will serve our generation and the generations to come differently. So it's an exciting and empowering process. The violence, physical violence, is also always dire, but structural violence is with us every day, and we don't acknowledge that often enough either. So let me stop there, James, and back to you. But yeah, excited to be amongst all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, I might if you're able to just, like at the end there, like if you can drill that down to a concrete example of what's going on right now, would be great.
So one of the things that's been happening is across the board, there's been a peace process or a dialogue. So you'll never see this reported on TV, but thanks to Zoom and thanks to the age we live in, people have been in a steady conversation for 8 months. A bit like what Emelda was calling for is let's have more of these hard conversations because we now have this incredible technology to do it. So a number of stakeholders, different ethnic people, parties, armed groups, young people, civil disobedience leaders have been in a conversation together. What kind of country do we want? What kind of values do we want? Where are we taking this? What's the process to get there? What kind of leadership do we expect? What are the mechanisms in place to hold people to account? And so that conversation happening at the same time that there's a military crackdown and the economy's collapsing and so on and so forth is really driving people forward rather than dwelling in this sort of negative, well, you know, we're all getting killed and we're all getting attacked and arrested. That's going on, no question. That will always go on unless something new is born and grows out of it. So it's very concrete. They have very clear roadmap, a very clear new constitution in mind, different ways of pushing that forward and slowly reaching out to other countries to say, look, you buy in with us, this is what you get. We're going to build a different future here. It's very connected to what we know as the Milk Tea Alliance, which is other movements similarly in Thailand and Hong Kong and other places. I think it's very interesting that China is engaging it. We often have a perception that China only goes with the bad players, but they're actually engaged in a number of stakeholders and also listening and trying to work out for the next 100 to 300 years, what does this look like? And I think that's a very telling thing about the way that China works is they don't think, as Susanne was describing about, you know, a 2-year project cycle where you get a little bit of money in order to do your piece work. They're looking
they've had 3,000 years of practice of working long term.
Exactly. So a very different concept of time. And I think that's something that we in Australia have never really acknowledged enough is what's the difference between 40,000 years to a ridiculous 200 plus and how significantly different that grounds you and how it shapes your sense of what's possible into the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Emma. I couldn't have asked for a better way to lead into my next speaker, which is to introduce Anne Noonan. One of the things that was on my mind as we were formulating this whole thing was, you know, talking about all the stuff that might be happening outside Australia. And even though a lot of Raising Peace overall has been about stuff happening at home, it's an injustice in itself if we don't then reflect on sort of the implications of Australia's own domestic actions and how that connects to our ability to work overseas. And I think those points that Emma just raised, you know, what values, what leadership, what process should be taken to hold people to account from the Myanmar context is something that is worthwhile exploring here as well. But Anne, as someone who, you know, you're a psychiatrist working primarily with people in Central Australia, but you've also got a very global outreach and interest in your work and life history too. What have you taken out of what we've heard so far today in terms of this local international connection?
Look, I'm in perfect agreement with. I think people have all said it absolutely wonderfully. It is about relationship. It is about not being bullied by the big boys. It's about listening to what's going on in this region. It's about listening to young people, video, data. But as Michael said, it's about listening to your past. I've just really felt like I belong here. And I've got a couple of quick anecdotes which I'll tell from my childhood youth, which have been sort of elaborated here. My father fought in Morocco in the Second World War. So he would always, you know, great admirer of the West Papuan people. I remember my mother and I being on a train in Queensland, about 48, I was a little girl, and there were these Indonesians there who'd, I think, been in Australia. They were so happy to get independence. from the Netherlands. And my mother was so happy, and we were all so happy. And then it's turned around to what we know is happening in West Papua now, a bit like, I guess, Israel and Palestine. So that was one little thought. And the other thing my father used to say about the islands, he'd say, they're leaving all this equipment here. It's just rubbish. It's spoiling the islands. And this is what you're saying, Jeanne. You know, all this stuff's been dumped there and people have got to deal with it. My mother was born in Myanmar, part of the British colony. I think my parents were both very progressive. You know, Australia was a penal colony. So you've got a whole history of the Irish here. One of the reasons bloody is such a favourite word in Australia is because they were not allowed to speak Gaelic. So they were bloody because they had no other language that they could sort of say. So there's such a lot of history here. And, you know, what has happened, of course, it's happened much less, but it's happened here. And, you know, I really think there's a big risk of, you know, talk about neocolonisation. I'm a member of the Medical Association Prevention of War. We're very worried about the nuclear stuff. You know, what's going on now is just, you know, appalling. I think that's about all I'll say for now, but I really feel I belong here. And it's so interesting to hear stories and things I've picked up through my life being elaborated here in so many different ways. So thank you all.
Thank you. Okay.
Just say one more thing. I work in the Central Alice Springs Correctional Service in the prison there. All the prisoners are Indigenous. Maybe the odd Indonesian that's gone on the wrong shipping route, you know, fishing and stuff like that. I mean, it's absolutely appalling. All the custodians, the prison officers are white, some Polynesians, and quite a lot of them are very nice people. But the whole system is appalling and ridiculous. You cannot tell me that in the whole of Alice Springs, there are no non-Indigenous people who are not criminals. You know, it's just ridiculous. But they're all Indigenous. And they have such resilience and dignity and stick up for each other and share. They sleep in cells at night, 8 to a cell, and they leave the television on all night, which zaps people, you know. So I like working there, and have to be a bit subversive sometimes.
Yeah, you remind me of like some work that Peacifica did, which we published last year, which was looking at the perspectives of Pacific Island people from Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Fiji. You know, sort of their view of their place in the world. And this also springs from the conversation with Emelda as well just now. That looking at Australia, what they weren't seeing was, you know, Indigenous faces, First Nations faces. They weren't the people they were seeing or they were hearing, because there were, you know, very obvious sort of tiers in society. And in addition, the continuity between the blackbirding history and the the desired but still deeply flawed labour migration policies that are in place now. That, you know, these things, the way the past affects the present, I think, is something that is very apparent from outside the country.
And the competition of capitalism, sort of pitting people against each other. Yeah.
On that note, I'd like to invite everyone to come back in. Let's just spend the rest of our time here, in addition to answering any questions that may appear. People have been very polite and quiet, but I'd rather you put 1 or 2 questions in the chat. But looking ahead, we've had, I think, a combination of some hopeful. I mean, the Emma's talking about what's happening in Myanmar as a really hopeful and encouraging story, and the continued determination of Ronny and everyone working on West Papua and cleaning up the Pacific Islands. There's so many good things going alongside those sort of, you know, the heart sickness that many people feel in relation to Afghanistan in particular. But so a general question is, what are you hoping for next in your work, and how would you like people to engage with, you know, that in particular, or in this work generally? So yeah, who'd like to lead off on that?
I've got a wish list.
Go for it, Emelda.
Well, obviously through our organisation, one of the challenges here is the lack of education and understanding of this particular history. And I'm being selfish here with all the other challenges that are, you know, across the Pacific, Asia Pacific, but Australian South Sea Islanders in particular are very seldom a part of the curriculum. And that's a big thing, is to start with educating those next generations or those younger students and getting that information into our curriculum, so at least people can be sparked to think, oh my God, did this happen? Or, you know, people that are committed. We need to sit alongside also our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families as we progress through this political, you know, colonial narrative, yeah? Because people will never understand the dynamic of this history in this country. And I heard Anne speak about the jails being full, which is, it's horrific. I've got family in prisons, and they say it's like you're in the Pacific or in Vanuatu, like 98% Torres Strait, South Sea and Aboriginal people. These jails are full of our, you know, next generations. So, and they're actually educating people on South Sea Islander history to understand who we are in terms of identity. So the domino effects of this displacement, you know, and what that means is greater education within our school systems, and those educators who can assist with being consistent, because consistency is a key to success. You know, if we continue to work in the same spaces together, and then, you know, obviously, you know, the community building through the arts and the culture and you know, reconnection with language, reconnecting the families. I'm just talking from Australia and the Blackbird history, but, you know, I think a lot of this kind of peace building, it starts with local knowledge and knowledge base and, you know, learning from each other. So, you know, very place-based, of course, but yeah, that's just, education is a big thing for us, and that access and equity to meaningful programs and services. You don't hear it, we're absorbed under multiculturalism. You know, and what does that mean? When you're recognised by the Commonwealth as a distinct cultural group who've suffered these atrocities, and still there's no strategic action plan, despite the continued speaking. And every time there's a new government, we have to go back out and educate all the ministers. I mean, that's stupid. And they've gone to some of the best schools in this country. You know, so you know, we're tired. It's like, seriously.
Yeah, there's a question which has popped up in the chat. If there's a change in government at the next federal elections in Australia, what might this mean for West Papua and the Pacific Islands? And it's a great question. And I think your point about re-education being a constant process is dampens one's optimism. But I might actually, Ronny, seeing as West Papua was mentioned in that question, what would you, I guess, what's your hope for the future? And yes, what do you think that a new government would need to be able to do something about it?
Thank you, James, and also for the question. Before I answer that second question, but back to the first one, in response to what can we do moving forward, it's always important that we see how is the issues that we advocated bound or connected to the issues that we all are sharing here, and that is important, because I can share all these conversations, West Papua story or you know, the story from the region and other conflict area. But at the end, if there's no space that we see the cross point there, then it's a conversation that we'll kind of go back, and then we'll go back into the confine of those spaces that we advocate in, and that's it. So for me, if there is the capacity of anyone within this virtual space that we're sharing all these different issues, how can we build that capacity to amplify each other's voice? So making sure that the word solidarity comes into living, rather than it's a word that we say, yeah, solidarity. Because if we talk on all these issues, the injustice, human rights abuses, atrocities, self-determination, how can we use the capacity of our advocacy to strengthen the capacity and the voice of these other issues that the speakers have addressed here as well? And that's one first thing that I want to highlight. And tapping into the media, we need people to write in the columns, in the op-eds within the mainstream media to amplify this. Until then, that creates public opinion and knowledge. And this goes into the second question around, if the general election comes up, and what would be the focus on West Papua or Pacific? If there's more written up about these issues within the region, then the members of parliament will be on notice that, hey, there are some of these issues that when they were in government, or they talk about it rhetorically within their policies, but there's no action, they're doing something else, then they are held accountable because of the public knowledge that is put out there. So, for example, with West Papua, Australia and Indonesia have signed a defense cooperation, which will be effective in the coming election. And what that means is that the Australian federal or the Australian taxpayers' money is going to go into training, aiding, funding the Indonesian death squad. There are facts. IBC 730 report in 2012 highlighted how the anti-terrorism unit used those training and in a broad daylight massacre, killed one of the peaceful activists, Mako Tabuni, in June of 2012. And we're seeing that again. And thanks to some of the journalists through The Guardian have continuously to write and keep that, shine the light on that issue. So this would be a case that the point I'm highlighting here. Yeah. Many of us, if we see these issues, we have to interlink that, make it relevant to the context here with how Australia's foreign policies is so caught up with geostrategic, geosecurity, economic interests, and calling out the government, especially if there are multinational companies that are putting money behind this and are supporting the parties or members of parliament in enhancing the next election or influencing the next election. Calling them out is critical, because in that way, then the public knowledge and opinion are created to really highlight the very issues that we're talking. And that's not to not mentioning about the First Nation issue, which other speakers have highlighted here. It goes hand in hand or side by side in making sure that yes, these issues is pretty much in the national interest. And just quickly on the Pacific, the climate change, the Pacific leaders, the community have highlighted climate change is the single, it's an existential threat on security, on human security. This is where the push in the lead up to COP26, even to the next general election, should be the triggering point in terms of focus on Australia government, especially the current government, to shift from that mindset of economic interest into looking at the impacts of coal mining that will be having within this region. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Ronny. As the clock is running down here, Michael, you have your hand up.
Thanks, James. Very quickly. Couple of points. One was mentioned already by Emelda in her comments, and one of the things was to do with education. And I certainly remember when I got educated that I didn't really, I paid allegiance to the Queen with due respect to the royal family and all the rest of the aspects that really make us part of a great community of Commonwealth nations. I didn't learn anything about myself and my place and my people and all the rest of it. And so quite often that's really an aspect now that we are now part of coming back into PNG now, and particularly in the Highlands and in the Western Highlands. We are now, a small group of us are now getting together to really make our own history and our own heritage, particularly our tribal communities, their ancestry and the emergence into where their lands are and how they have come to be where they are. And that needed to be documented and made available to our youth and up and coming and for our future gen, because that's a gap that's continued. And if I was going to be the impact of that kind, and if I realize now, I think I owe it to myself and my children and those that follow to know that there is a record, there is a story that must be told of how things were, aside from colonization. Colonization definitely was an imposition, and it's there, and it's also part of our history. We don't need to deny it. We just need to have to now share the space. And so I think education for me has been a significant aspect of getting a sense of this. I must say, in First Nations in Australia, for example, and this is not really wanting to cheapen the efforts that have been made thus far. There's a greater shift in the focus, I must say, but there's much to go for yet. The thing is, so to speak, you have the enemy inside in terms of ideas and people, but in terms of the ideas and the stories and the history. So you have the opportunity to counter that. In places like PNG, and some of them are Pacific, we don't have the enemy. The enemy comes in, makes thrusts, and pushes itself in ways that are quite often unannounced, or in many ways, very much in kept with official policy, but at the same time, a sustainability that's designed for their own keep, be that economic, political, or whatever you. So in that sense, the enemy is not inside, it's quite often hidden. And that kind of attitude now needs to come back with a countervailing that relates to education, and learn about yourself first, and your language first, and your history first, so that you then have a sense of a future, if you like. And I also like the idea that Susan mentioned about, punitive as opposed to restorative justice, and the process of it, and dealing that in a community-based where communities do matter, and community is comprised of people. So when you talk of punitive justice processes, there is a way in which communities get affected. And of course, there's a move towards protecting the community. And so communities then go against the law. And so in that sense, it escalates into other things. So there is a need for us to relook at and redesign some of the ways in which we do to resort justice and find justice and fight for peace in our community. There needs to be alternative mechanisms. So I thought those were two good points, and certainly in where I am now, certainly advocating for those and wanting to make something out of these things. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Michael. If people are willing, we will go a couple of minutes past 3:30, but we still need to skip it along. Emma, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to connect this conversation because I think this is a really powerful conversation about human security, which is a terrible term, but is really about how do we as humans feel safe. And yet here we have the possibility to buy nuclear submarines because somehow we think that's going to make us safer. And I think that it's still shocking that we as a nation haven't been able to connect. The fact that humans feel safer when they're heard, when they're seen, when they're not excluded, when they don't feel the need to take up arms, whether they're in southern Philippines or in North Korea where they're excluded, or in Myanmar or in any other place. So Australia as a nation spends billions of dollars on combating violent extremism, looking out for Islamist terrorists, and now buying nuclear submarines, which makes me feel sick when actually we could invest in the kind of things that we're talking about in this conversation. Even just acknowledging our own complicity in situations like in Afghanistan, even in our own history, would significantly make us safer. And I can't understand it. It's the same attitude that locks people up in the conversation that Anne had, to buying nuclear weapons to make us feel safer. It just doesn't work. And the sooner we acknowledge that, the safer we'll be and the more connected we'll be as a community.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to pass across to Elise now on SafeGround. We haven't heard enough from them so far, so it's yours.
Thank you so much, James, and thanks everyone for having me. Yeah, I'll just give a quick overview of sort of the future of the project that we're working on at SafeGround. So far we've been doing sort of the analysis of the spending that's been done in the Pacific Islands so far, as well as building a database of stakeholders. So the next sort of thing does kind of align with our conversation about working together, because the next part of our project is going to rely really heavily on collaboration, both with individuals and organizations who want to see a Pacific free of explosive remnants of war. So that will include international and within Australia, but an integral sort of part of this process is going to be engaging with locals, particularly survivors of ERW, explosive remnants of war, in Honiara and Solomon Islands, which will sort of lead to our next phase, which will be developing a network of survivors in Honiara and producing a report that will be based off interviews with members of the community as well. And then after we've sort of established a solid foundation of networks and stakeholders, then we'll be able to tackle related issues such as dynamite fishing. That's kind of one of the next phases of our project, which is where people use unexploded ordnance to create small bombs that they then throw into the ocean to kill a bunch of fish. It makes the fishing process a lot faster and cheaper, but it's really super damaging for the environment, as well as very dangerous for the people involved. But yeah, so the type of connections that we're hoping to make, especially in the initial phase of the project, include sort of funding partners, advocates, campaigners. We want to do information exchange as well as any operational delivery. And yeah, if anyone wants to be involved, or you can think of an individual organization who might want to, then feel free to contact us as well. I think Jeannie's just put out emails in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Susanne, very quickly.
I have to apologize because I have to run fairly soon. I'm running a series of expert workshops about figuring out what we can do in Afghanistan. So I'm not sure whether I have got much to say right now about it, other than I think we need to be aware that there is a crisis emerging in Afghanistan, that the economy has collapsed. I'm not even sure it's collapsing, it has collapsed. Money is very a scarce commodity in Afghanistan, and people are actually not having enough to eat. So I think we need to understand the consequences sometimes of our disengagement. I found it very interesting again to listen to Emma and the experience in Myanmar, because I do think there is something brewing in Afghanistan. Society has changed. The Taliban men have changed. They're functioning fairly predictable right now. We all were desperately hoping they changed. But society has changed a great deal, and there's people willing to push back and push back against. And I think these people need to be supported. Right now, Western donor countries are not necessarily the best ones to look for that support, because they right now have frozen most of the funding that is not humanitarian into the country. So there'll be a lot of the controlling of money going in. I think, I actually think we can't abandon peace building right now. And I think there'll be a big debate. So I think we need to keep that alive, because that support needs to happen. There is no peace in Afghanistan right now. There certainly is no peace on the lower level. What we have is negative peace, in the sense that one party took power, and that probably won't last either. So I think the solidarity that we particularly as white people can show with Afghans in Afghanistan or left, a solidarity and helping them to work out that mess, which is in great part to our making. And I'm pointing now again to the white people, is in our making. I think, we need to hold our governments accountable that we can't cut and run. We can't certainly just say we had 20 years support for a Western supported peace building project, and now we're just going to pull out and do only humanitarian action, because we don't like what the outcome was. I think we also at the same time need to hold our governments accountable for allowing the people that are very at risk in Afghanistan. There's still particularly a great deal of women rights defenders at great risk in Afghanistan that didn't make it out. Because and our asylum systems have already shut down the borders. So I think there needs to be a lot of pressure on our governments to be responsible and pick that up and show solidarity with the people that come here, need to integrate, that many feel like they've lost something, and help the ones that are willing to fight for peace in their countries. Back home in Afghanistan, and find ways to supporting that in solidarity that is not dependent on state funding, because that's right now, from experience, is often the most fickle, unfortunately. So that's all I have to say.
No, thank you, Susanne. And thank you, everyone. I think we managed to get something from everyone at the end there. Wonderful, rich, sampling there of all the great work that's going on around the region. So thank you all for your time, and to the audience's time. It's worthwhile saying, if you go to the Raising Peace website, you can donate to Raising Peace to help us do more of this stuff, which has been amazing itself. But also, we're splitting all the money that we receive through the festival, so that some will go towards Afghanistan, and we haven't quite pinned down who's going to receive that, but it's sort of the most clear and present need right now. Also on the website, you can catch up on various past sessions, and we will be adding those over the next few weeks too. And do come along to the stuff on the weekend. There is more to come, and it'll be a blast. So thank you all very much. Thank you all very much for this afternoon. It's been a pleasure.